All right, so today's guest is David Berez. I met David through a community called The Power of Our Story, which I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about throughout our conversation. But David, thank you so much for being here and chatting with me today.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much. And it's really honestly an honor to be with you and be part of the platform that you've created for families and for police officers and other first responders. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Like I said, I'm super excited to talk about you. I think this is going to be a really fun conversation, but there's also as I was reading your book, there's so many parallels. I feel like not only are we kind of close in proximity, but you consider New York City your second home. New York City was my home for over 10 years. In the book, you mention Yardley, Pennsylvania, which I think is how a connection to Yardley is how your parents maybe met, if I'm recalling correctly.
Yeah, I mean, super long time ago. That was probably 1970, 69 or 70. And yeah, they met through a mutual friend. It's kind of a long story. My mom was on a random trip in Israel that she went with her mother back in 68 or 69. And they were on a bus trip with some woman that was from Yardley, PA. My mom was from East Brunswick, New Jersey, and which is about a half hour up the road. And they were invited to, she ended up being invited to her wedding. And my father was college friends with the soon-to-be husband, and that's where they met at their wedding.
That's so cool. And Yardley is literally the next town over from where I live now. So,
And the next time over for me on the other side of the river.
oh, there you go. So it's
Yep.
exactly in between us.
Yep.
So yeah, I just feel like that was kind of fun as I was reading your book. Which we will get into your book. But first, I kind of want you to introduce yourself, a little bit about your background. Why did you decide to become a cop? I always love to learn a little bit more about that.
So I did 20 years as a police officer, and we'll come back full circle in a second. But when I was growing up, I was a unhealthy child, allergy, tonsil issues. So I ended up in tonsil and adenoid removal at 7 years old. So I was a really sick child, and I that was my first introduction to like the medical world. And I always wanted to be a doctor after that because I just thought the doctors and nurses were the coolest people ever, and they saved me, and I could do the same thing for other people. So that's when 14 years old came around, and I was like, cool, I want to start that path and become a volunteer in EMS. And so starting at the age of 14, I was a volunteer on the local rescue squad, and then at 16 in EMT, and then at 18 was able to do all of the fun stuff like the rescue technician stuff. And then I went off to college, and I was like, cool, I'm going to do this pre-med thing and become a doctor or pediatrician and save kids' lives. Well, first semester, freshman year of college, I had to take a botany class, which is the study of plant cells. And botany got botched. So it was terrible and it did not work out. And I realized if I can't figure out plant cells, I can't figure out kids. So I put the whole medical school thing on, not even on the back burner. It completely got dumped into the sink. Uh, and there was no way that was going to happen. So I came home winter break freshman year, and I was volunteering as an EMT on Christmas. And I was sat down with one of the police officers that were in town that I was friendly with, and it was kind of an epiphany moment for me. That I realized, you know what, I belong in emergency services, and police work is definitely more my thing than EMS. Because in New Jersey specifically, they get paid like 3 times the amount that EMTs do. And it was a lot more fun, the training opportunities and networking, and just a different type of culture that was more for me. So I went back to school early after winter break, changed all my classes over to criminal justice. My mom got the bill and goes, "What the heck is going on here?" And I was like, "Well, medicine's out, as you can see from the first semester transcript. That wasn't going to happen." So criminal justice it is, and it's kind of started my path. So my degree from college was criminal justice and sociology, and when I graduated, I I went right to the medical examiner's office for a year for an internship, which kind of combined the whole medical and law enforcement thing, which was a really cool experience. I was an intern at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office for 1 year in Manhattan. And man, did I learn more in 1 year than I learned in the rest of my life. It was insane. If you can die by it, I've seen it. Um, it's and all the stereotypes of all the different cultures are true. And there was lots of concrete shoes and whatever else. So it's crazy. But yeah, so that's kind of how I dipped into the law enforcement world. And then while I was in college, I did two internships, one at school and then one at home. And both of them were in the law enforcement field in the local police departments, and I loved it. So when I graduated and I finished the medical examiner's office year, I took all the tests I needed to take. I hired by my local police department, and I did a year in Seaside first as a special. We call New Jersey has a what's called special law enforcement officers or part timers. That it's a good way to start or a good way to end your career. And we usually walk the boardwalk and do all the fun beach stuff. Um, and yeah, so then I did full time in East Windsor PD for 20 years and 1 month before I retired and moved on to civilian world again.
That's awesome. And you, like I said, I read your book and you have had quite a career. You've shared all kinds of stories in your book. I want to get into your book a little bit and then we can talk about some more of the stuff that you're doing. So your book is called A Resilient Life. And again, I found it really impactful. I cried. I told you this already, but I cried almost every time I would pick it up and read another 10 pages. Um, why why did you decide to write the book first?
So I never decided to write the book. I think that's an important factor here. The book decided to write me, which was an interesting reversal on how it actually came to be. When I retired January 1st of 2020, I did not do it with grace. I also did not do it with purpose. And it was a very tumultuous experience for me that culminated with the suicide of a very close friend that worked one town over. And I retired January 1st, 2020. So if we do the math on that, we have COVID and then all the civil unrest that followed shortly thereafter. And I felt lost. I felt like I had no purpose anymore. And then my only purpose was truly supporting the guys that were still fighting the battles on the street, which was COVID and the unrest. And here in Trenton during the unrest, we had a lot going on as well. And so I would leave cases of beer, on friends' porches and stuff like that when they came home. And I had a very close friend that was really struggling with betrayal from his department, the people that worked for him, his community, and even his family. Uh, and he ended up taking his own life because it got him. And then I took stock after that and realized, you know what? If it wasn't him, it may have been me, and I needed to recalibrate. That recalibration came in the form of a program called New Jersey's Office of Resiliency for Law Enforcement. And we put together a resiliency program, which I was part of the second cohort for. We can get back into that in a few minutes. Uh, and then the book then kind of started to form as a suicide note of my own. And I realized that everything I was dealing with, I did not want my kids to remember me in the way that they had me in that moment in time, and not knowing what tomorrow would bring for me or if tomorrow would be for me. I did not want them knowing who I was then. I wanted them to know who I was for the 44 years before that. And so I kept all these notes and I kept some documentation of what I wanted them to know. And then I kind of put it together in a short format essay. And a friend of mine was like, you know what? That needs to be a book. I'm like, I don't want to write a book. But I started to fill in, I should say, some of the blank spaces in that story. And the catharsis of writing all of this down is what literally saved my life. And I couldn't imagine having not done that at this point because there was so many stories, so many things that came back to mind through that process that I was like, darn, this is some good stuff. And I'm glad my kids will know this. But by the time I got to the end of the book, I was so proud of where I've come and where I was that I felt like the book needed to be published. And doing so literally put me in a space where I felt proud of my life and no longer felt at risk for wanting to end with no further chapters. So that's kind of how the book came about.
Wow. And I see the book behind you and I have it here. I love the photo that you chose to put on the cover of you walking with your kids. Um, so if you
That
think about
photo,
it,
I should say, is a special one, not just as the cover, but for me as well, because that was my retirement day.
oh
And
wow.
it's kind of in visual, it visually for me, it takes me back to walking home for the
Hmm.
final time with my kids. And to me, that was such a powerful moment that
Hmm.
I felt like the art of that picture needed to be shared as the kind of the overarching concept of the book.
Yeah. Wow, that's impactful. I love that. Um, yeah, that's amazing. So if you think about it, January of 2020 is not that long ago. You've come a long way since then, I think is safe to say.
I think so.
What I know that the riots were hard for me. Like I said, I was in New York City and it was really tough for me to watch. I can't imagine being a freshly retired cop watching it. So talk a little bit about what that was like and how you kind of started to turn the tables and work on yourself and get yourself into a better headspace and how you did that.
So it kind of, and I'll answer that in reverse. The better headspace came from writing and being able to express myself, getting the scrambled eggs of thoughts in my head out of there and onto paper where they were organized chaos rather than just straight up chaos inside my head. And that relief of not having to think about them anymore because I could reflect on them on the paper. They were still there. They still existed. Those are my thoughts, my ideas, and my concerns. But I no longer had to have that occupy my headspace. So if I wanted to revisit those thoughts and ideas, I could read through them in an organized way on paper, but they were no longer occupying my moment to moment consciousness where I was unable to do anything else because that space was clogged up. So that's how I ended up on the better side of where I was. Now, during that time of the riots and everything that was going on, whether it be in the media or locally, it was very challenging to sit on my couch and I was glued to the scanner. I was glued to the news and I was glued to my phone, whether it be social media, text messages, whatever, the communications from my friends, literally listening to radio transmissions of my someone I stood shoulder to shoulder with only weeks or months earlier, getting bottle rocket attacks, getting their cars flipped and burned, and just listening to the exhaustion in their voices was heartbreaking to me. Not because they only because they were going through it, but I couldn't be there to support them. I felt I had my retirement had betrayed them. Listen, the truth is, no one person in this job is the job. And my involvement was not going to change the circumstances. It wasn't going to influence a stop to what was going on. It wasn't going to save anybody from getting hurt. But not being there shoulder to shoulder with my brothers and sisters who were in the fight was devastating to me. And I didn't process it well. I was up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I was sitting on my front porch with my gun in my lap, not for me, but in case anybody came to my house that didn't belong there. And I was literally losing my marbles. I wasn't in the right frame of mind. I wasn't processing the information in a way that was productive or logical. But then writing put all that slowly to an end. And the process of writing, and by the way, the research shows that to be true, that writing allows you to organize and process um, what you're what you can't process on your own in your own head. And that's all part of the storytelling aspect. The science behind storytelling is so powerful, whether it's art, literary art, visual art, music, so many different aspects of it. And that's kind of what I'm focusing on now in this stage of my life. So, but yeah, it was a tough time. And the writing piece is what truly got me through it. And of course, my family.
And what did that look like, the writing piece? Was it like, wait, because you sit down and you write, try to write, and you're like, I don't know what to write. Was it just like a daily brain dump where you just wrote down whatever came to your head?
Sometimes it was a daily brain dump. I didn't keep a journal per se, but I have sticky notes and notebooks and papers all over the place. So that did help. But what really helped was creating articles that I self-published on LinkedIn, because it allows you to do that in the format that they have. Some of those were picked up by different media outlets as well. And being able to articulate my thoughts, my emotions, and my feelings and my perspective on something was not only helpful for me to get it out of my head, but it was also helpful for me to understand that maybe someone else that didn't have the context that I had was reading this and changed their perspective. So when you go back into the law enforcement field, one of the main things that is necessary but troublesome at the same time is that you don't have an opinion. You can have an opinion, but you're just not allowed to share it with anybody. You can't have media contact. You can't be public facing with something that is not neutral. And that becomes a challenge to buckle that down into yourself for so long over the course of your career. And it overflows at some point. And how it overflows can either be productive or catastrophic. And for me, it was initially catastrophic, but then I found a way to do it in a way that was productive. And writing was that avenue for me. And being able to share those thoughts that I had harbored for so long in a way that was generating a new conversation and one that potentially changed other people's perspectives on what law enforcement is about, how they do it, and why they do it was important to me, because nobody in this job goes to work every day wanting to hurt somebody. And if there is somebody in that capacity, there's there's turds in every field, right? Like there's people that make bad choices and do bad things with bad intention. We don't have many of those in law enforcement, but they exist. They're there. We've seen it. To vilify an entire career or a group of people over the one or two that make the news, and was devastating to me, because we, as a profession, we're really noble folks that are just trying to do the best for our communities that we serve, because generally they're the communities we live in. So we're not going to turn these communities into chaos when we have to live there.
Yeah.
So when those storylines hit the news and in the media, or even elected officials turn these things into talking points and platforms for themselves, was something that I felt I needed to change along the way. So altering that narrative from what the public was seeing by a complicit, I believe, complicit media in a lot of this, I needed to personally change one person at a time. And that's what helped me through it, is knowing that I was making a bit of a difference, and it gave me purpose.
And I think that's a really important point to make, because one thing that I'm finding the more I speak to cops, but also just the public about what it is that I'm doing and other civilians, is I'm realizing they don't understand. If
Mm-mm.
they're not in it, like I'm so in it. I grew up in it, so it's second nature to me. But if they're not, if they don't have law enforcement in their family or in their circle, they really do just kind of rely on what they see online or in the media or whatever is highlighted, the flavor of the month. And it's not always to their fault, because they don't think like, oh, let me do some research on law enforcement and see what they're
Right.
really all about. And it took me a long time to realize that. I was so resentful towards so many people, because to me it was like they're moms and dads and sons and daughters. And to other people, they're not. They're whatever the media is putting out there. And so as I started sharing more about, what law enforcement does, what it's comprised of, beyond that, that's making the headlines, people in my circle in the past, whatever it is, were coming out of the woodwork like, wow, I didn't realize this. Thank you for sharing this. This is really important information. And just all of these things that I never realized. Because to me, it's like, why don't you understand what they do every day? Like, they literally keep you safe. They literally might save a baby's life and then have to go tell someone that someone died. And
Yeah.
their job is insane. And how do you not realize that? How do you not see that? And there was just like a disconnect for me. So I love that you sort of took it upon yourself, whether intentionally or it just happened by accident, to educate the general public, because I think that's really important right now, because like I said, they're getting their information just from what they see. Once upon a time, it was what they saw on TV. Now it's in their face all the time, and
Yeah.
it's negative more often than not.
And with whatever media outlets you choose to indulge in, they're generally echo chambers, and you gravitate to stories and storylines that are consistent and in line with your personal beliefs on something, and nobody challenges themselves to understand something from a different perspective. And then, well, on the social media side, those algorithms get built upon what you search for. So if you're searching for a specific topic in a specific way, you're going to be force fed information that aligns with those questions. You're not often going to be fed information that challenges your perspective with a different understanding of maybe there's a different angle to this, because that's not what makes money, unfortunately. And I found it very purposeful and very enlightening. And just like you said, people raise eyebrows when you have these conversations with them. And my favorite recent example is this past weekend. We were sitting in a hotel in the city of Philadelphia, and my family sat down next to this older couple, and they're like, what are you doing here? It's graduation. And they asked, oh, what do you graduate with? So I told them about the program. And like, oh, what do you plan to do with that? And I was like, well, I'm a retired police officer that supports law enforcement. And they were about to get up because I could tell that they weren't interested in that conversation. But then the older gentleman asked me a question about policing, and it started a conversation. And then we were there for about a half hour. Everybody got from the table from breakfast, went their separate ways. My son goes to the bathroom, and he comes back with this big smile on his face. I'm like, oh, what happened in the bathroom, bro? And he's like, no, that guy you're talking to is in the bathroom. And when I was walking out, I heard him tell his wife how great it was to meet a police officer and to hear their story. And it gave me a new understanding of what law enforcement is about and what they do. And this was like a 75-year-old guy who was, an Ivy League graduate with who knows how many degrees. He was clearly quite intelligent, and he didn't get it until he got it. And so without telling those stories, without having these conversations, people are going to remain in their echo chamber. So it's so important to share with even the most unsuspecting of people. And you just never know whose mind you can change and what perspectives you can add.
Which I think goes back to what you mentioned in the beginning about the importance of storytelling and just being willing to share your story.
Absolutely. And there's two parts of it, quite frankly, to storytelling. There's the storytelling, which makes you feel better, which is essentially what we're talking about with the book. But there's also the receiver saying, hey, I can see myself in that story, and it humanizes the person telling it. And both of those are important when you're talking about, either emotional regulation or just putting perspectives in place so you have an empathy or compassion for other people.
Yeah. So speaking of storytelling, there were a few stories in the book that I wanted to just talk about a little bit, if you don't mind.
Of course. All
Um, so the first one was towards the beginning, and it was about a family friend who turned out to be a bit of a creep, to say the least. And it was so interesting to me because I grew up, my dad was lieutenant of Special Victims Unit, and the I didn't even read the entire first sentence when you introduced those people in the book, and I was like, this is bad news. This is bad news. And then I went on to read, and sure enough,
it was
I
bad
was
news.
right. It was bad news. And I thought that was really interesting, as I was reading it and in retrospect, because it just kind of does show how different our mindsets are. Your mom was, you were a child at the time, and your mom did not have a law enforcement background or anything like that. She was just a mom raising her kids versus me, the child of law enforcement. And I'm like, red flag, red flag, red flag. Looking back on that, would you say like there were some red flags?
So that particular individual, there were red flags from day one. Eh, You don't have to be in law enforcement. You don't have to have a strong situational awareness in your life to understand or recognize when the hair stands up on the back of your neck, it's time to go.
Yeah.
And I think innately in our fight or flight mechanisms that we're born with, mechanisms of survival, that you need to pay attention to those feelings. And I was brought up in a way that those feelings weren't defined for me. So I know I felt them at the time. I can reflect back on feeling them at the time, but I didn't know what they were, because my mom, as awesome as she was also quite naive. My grandma was quite naive, which is surprisingly interesting to me based on her background as a survivor of, being a Jewish survivor of World War II Germany. Um, and the fact that they didn't pick up on this, their spidey senses didn't pick up on the creepiness of their friends. And they, even my addressing it with them over time, not having the proper language before things really went sideways, they still, I don't want to say they didn't believe me, because I don't think that's fair. I just don't think they could believe it to be possible.
Mm.
And that naivety that they both carried with them unfortunately led to an interaction with this individual that was a family friend that is regrettable.
Mhm.
Uh, and yeah, reflecting back on it though, I definitely knew something was wrong, but I didn't have the language or the understanding to understand what was wrong
Yeah.
until it
Yeah.
was too late.
Right. And I talked to a woman named Heidi Chance a couple weeks ago. I interviewed her for the podcast, and we talked about some of this stuff about how you have to talk to your kids about what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what kind of language to use to talk to your parents if you think something's inappropriate, and things of that nature. And she teaches civilians these things. She's in law enforcement, and she wants civilians to understand the dangers that are out there, because a lot of times they are naive and they do have rose colored glasses, and unfortunately it's, I mean, I think it's like a good and bad that people within law enforcement sort of have the spidey senses times a million, but also we learn things as kids, or we are aware of things as adults that maybe other people aren't, because they are a little bit more naive and they do kind of have a more positive view of the world in some ways. And one thing we talked about was this concept of adults asking children to keep secrets. And that is something that growing, I never even thought about it. Heidi brought it up on the conversation, and that's something that I was always taught. No adult should ever ask you to keep secrets from mom and dad. And it's something that people apparently just don't think about. And for me, I mean, it was always innate and it makes sense and it's very logical, but it's because of the rose-colored glasses, the seeing things in a positive light, and thinking the best of people, because why wouldn't you? It's something that sometimes gets missed by the general public or your everyday civilian parent. Um, so again, I think just like sharing these stories and spreading the awareness is really important. And I just love that so many different people are doing it in so many different realms across the various platforms that are out there.
Yeah, there's a concept called Red Cape, Green Cape that was formulated and put together by one of my mentors and college instructors, James Pawelski. Uh, and it talks about how you see the world, Red Cape being danger and bad stuff all the time, Green Cape being good things and positivity. And there's definitely something to say in the law enforcement world about a red cape perspective. It's what keeps us alive on the street. And if we teach our kids some of those red cape concepts, it hopefully keeps them safe as children, which is great. But it doesn't make you happy. It doesn't make you feel good when you're always in red cape
Yep.
thinking mode. And that's actually a problem we have in law enforcement, because we are always in red cape thinking mode. Uh, Going into green cape thinking mode is super important to get that level of well-being, that level of positivity that allows you to smile and be happy and feel joy. But we can't ignore the red cape concepts. So we talk about having reversible capes and when to wear which side. And teaching your children to see things from a safety perspective is super important, which is not necessarily an opportunity that I was afforded at that time in my life. But seeing it doesn't mean the exclusion of good things either. But
Mhm.
also, when you look at things from the Green Cape perspective, you can't exclude that there's bad people out there that do bad things. So the idea of having that reversible cape is important. And, Dr. Kowalski definitely articulates that much better than I do. But um, we need to teach our kids that there are bad people that do bad things and how to communicate their spidey senses to us when they are not feeling safe. And I agree with you that anytime an adult tells a child to keep a secret is a red flag.
Yeah.
And that is not necessarily something I was taught, partly because my parents told me to keep secrets from each other. Uh, so, my parents did not have a great marriage. So my mom would be like, oh, don't tell your dad, whatever. My dad would be, don't tell your mom. So to me, that was kind of normal when this guy said, oh, don't tell them this happened. And I was like, all right, you're an adult figure. I won't. But then over time, as things continued to transpire, I was like, something ain't right here. Um, but then, yeah, and as we document in the book, the guy just disappears over time,
Yeah.
um, and my family completely disconnected themselves from them.
Yeah. And okay, so this red cape, green cape thing is fascinating to me. I think that's a really good visual concept. I think it's something that my dad did really well. He wasn't like a super hyper vigilant guy, but again, we did have these lessons, we were taught these things, we did have certain rules in place that maybe some of our friends didn't. But then on the flip side, our parents were actually the most lenient in a lot of ways out of a lot of our friends.
They
Um,
trusted you.
yes, and that's exactly. And they created an environment where they could trust us and we could trust them. And I think that that's really important. And finding that balance and finding the like figuring out how to be able to reverse your cape, I think is the really important part. Do you know, is there like any sort of literature that people could read about that? Just if
There
anyone's
is,
struggling?
yeah. So it's I believe, a 2020, two actually 2020 journal articles written by James Pawelski, who is a University of Pennsylvania professor and career philosopher and the head of the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program. Those articles can definitely be found on Google Scholar if you have access to it. Uh, and if not, I have copies of them, and I'm happy to share them with you. But yeah, it's fascinating the way he articulates it, and understanding that the negative is not the absence of the positive, and the positive is not the absence of the negative. And somewhere in between, you got to find what works for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I would love to read those personally.
Next
Um,
email, I promise.
okay. So talking about your kids, one of my favorite stories in the book. So there's a portion of your book where you share various stories that stand out in your life, in your mind. And one of them you titled La Cucaracha because it's your kid's favorite. It's also like kind of PG, so it's one that you could share with your kids.
Absolutely.
And one story that my dad always shared with us, it was kind of like a general story, but it was very similar to the one that you share in the book. And he has always told it to us because it's PG, it's child friendly. It's about how he would go into houses to talk to victims or talk to, witnesses or whatever it was. And you know, he would have to like dust off the cockroaches from the couch if he wanted to sit down, or um,
Yep.
they would be in his coffee cup if they offered him coffee or, whatever it was. And so I really connected with your cockroach story.
That's awesome.
Um, but when it came to sharing stories with your kids, obviously that one's a fun one, a cute one. There's like a nice little song and dance involved in that one. Um, but how did you navigate sharing stories with your kids, or how do you do it now? Because some of your kids are still very young.
So my kids are currently 17 as of Tuesday, 15 as of July, and then my daughter's 10. So at this point, there's not a lot of police storytelling going on in my house. I've been retired 4.5 years. Um, and so now we talk more about where I'm at and the positive work that I'm doing at this point. But during the course of my career, I didn't ever want them to feel like I was hiding anything from them, going back to keeping secrets. And I was very fortunate to be able to often be at dinner with my kids at least once or twice a week. And they would ask, what went on at work this week, or what'd you do? And I was pretty honest with them. Of course, I wouldn't talk about the gory stuff. I wouldn't talk in the gory sense. I would say that, I responded to a motor vehicle crash today where unfortunately somebody did die. So we had to talk about that and we had to speak with the families. I would give them the PG version of the very much R-rated stories. And it made them feel included in my career. Obviously, my daughter at the time was much younger. She was 6 when I retired and didn't necessarily understand all of the ins and outs of what I was doing at 6 is a challenge. She definitely did like dancing to a cucaracho when that came up. But that she didn't get it. My boys definitely got it. And they still talk about some of them today, and they express how grateful they are to have shared my experiences with them in a way that was age appropriate. I should also note that at the time when I retired, well, yeah, during the last 12 years of my career, my wife worked for a company and she was a marketing director for the Trojan brand. So you have a cop's kid sitting at the dinner table with a spouse who makes condoms and vibrators for a living. So there's nothing my kids haven't heard in terms of social etiquette or lack thereof, and we're just very open with them. And I think it's important. Now we also put caveats on all our stuff. This is stuff we talk about at home, and they can't bring it to school. There's no show and tell, and if they have questions, they need to ask us. And we don't want them to get misinformation or potentially adverse reactions from people that may not understand. Interestingly, early on in their childhoods, a lot of their friends, they gravitated towards other first responder kids in their classes. And they seem to have shared their experiences in their relationship as children with each other, which was one of the parts that was very difficult for me when my buddy took his own life in July of 2020, is our kids were very good friends. And it they recognized at that point that daddy could be in trouble too. So there were conversations to be had there. My kids have not read the book, by the way, because there's definitely things in there that I said in the book for the first time in my life. And my wife, even when she read it, it was the first time she learned certain things. Similarly to the story we just talked about the creepy guy when I was a kid, up through my own mental health challenges, towards the end of my career. So there's a way that you can articulate everything you're going through in a way that's age appropriate for your kids, because you want them to be part of your story and they want to be part of yours. So there's ways to do it, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't hurt them and only helps them.
Yeah, I think that's important too, because I know for us, our dad shared stories with us in an age appropriate way. There were things he would leave out or things that he would kind of sugarcoat, or, obviously he wouldn't give details, especially working in special victims. But he did share stories with us because we wanted him to. He wasn't home, he was at work, and we wanted to know what he was doing all day. And if he hadn't, we probably would have felt left out, or like he was hiding something, or like something was wrong about what he was doing at work, or whatever it was. And I think that that really helped us connect with him and feel like we were part of his life, even though we were at home and he was at work. And then as we got older, we were kind of able, even to this day, like I'll ask him about a story that I just like happen to remember from when I was little, and he'll be able to share more details with me now, obviously as an adult. And so it's kind of cool how it like comes full circle, and I'm like thinking about these stories that they didn't seem so bad, and now I'm like, "Hey dad, tell me more about this story." And I'm like, "Oh wait, actually that was terrible." But again, I think it was really important for him to share those stories with us. And I know that it can feel like, oh, I can't share with my kids because what I see is so horrific. But I think that figuring out a way to make it age appropriate is really important because I think it's important to your kids and to their development.
Something that's valuable to remember as first responders is while we are out there doing that work, and I'm sure your dad would agree with this, and I know you have so many other family members in the business as well, and I'm sure a lot of them have been through this with their individual family cohorts. While we're out there doing the work, our spouses and our children are at home holding it together in the house. And they're not only doing the work that we're not doing at home, but they're worried about the work that we're doing at work. So the stress on them, while different, is just as impactful for them as us doing the job itself. And what we don't often realize as first responders is we bring that stress back home with us quite often, back into the house without putting a pause between work and home. And so now not only is our families stressed and worried and concerned with the work that we're doing, when we bring that level of stress back into the house, it does nothing good for your relationships. It does nothing good for the positive emotions that you have in the home, which the negative affect of you bringing work back home is um, just, it's horrible and very hard on the family. So I always found that it was, and I didn't do this well, by the way, but I found it important to put a pause between work and home, whether it was just slow rolling my way back home, or maybe doing a quick workout at the gym at work before coming home, even if it meant being a half hour later than I ordinarily would have. That half hour was an investment in the next 4 hours of positive interaction with my family, rather than coming home with a hot head or just being disconnected from my family. Because if you don't put that pause, you don't recalibrate, it's very challenging to get that effective time with your family when you are home. Because especially if you're working midnights and then you're trying to either sleep off for the weekend, or if you didn't sleep, now you're a complete shit show for the weekend. And we've all been there. It's a challenge, but it's important for us to remember that those that are serving inside the house, because we're serving outside of the house, need just as much support as the first responder themselves. And as first responders, we can't minimize the level of not only the stress, but the level of investment that our family members have in our careers. So it's important that we take care of them in the same way we take care of ourselves and each other.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of important things here. First of all, sharing stories can also help with the fear factor, I think.
Correct.
It's scary to be in the house not knowing what's going on at work. And I think if you share some of those stories, whether it's with your spouse or your kids or whoever it is, it can help them understand what's going on and understand because what they're thinking in their head might be like, oh my God, he's constantly in gunfights. But like reality is not so much.
Right.
So really having those honest conversations and the awareness is really important, I think. Um, but then also, I like what you said about maybe taking the beat before going home and having that conversation with your spouse where it's like, because the person at home might also just want you to come home and take the kids from them or
Right.
whatever it is, but
Absolutely.
like that might initially seem like a great idea, but it might not be. And so having that conversation where you explain to the other person where it's like, I need 30 minutes. I need to drive around the block or blow off some steam at the gym. And then I can show up for you and the family a million times better. And really being on the same page and having that as almost like a plan, when
Yes.
you get off work.
And while I'm not a meditator, it's not really my thing. I know a lot of people are, but having a mindful pause between an action and a reaction is so important, or even between two actions where the reaction then is the mindful pause. So putting that bubble space between events really creates an opportunity for recalibration. And sometimes it is meditation if that's for you. Sometimes it is the gym. Sometimes it could be reading a chapter of a book. Sometimes it may be just stop and look at the trees in the spring as they're blooming. Something that puts that bubble between those two pieces of your life so they don't collide in a way that is not helpful to either side.
Yeah. And I actually wanted to ask you about this, but we're kind of here. So, one thing you talk about in the book, and we're kind of dancing around it right now, is the concept of choir practice and going out for drinks after a shift
Yeah.
instead of going home. So, one thing I would love for you to talk about, like the pros and cons of that concept. And then also, as it relates to kind of what we're talking about now, is I've had people share with me, cops share with me that they want to go to the gym after work so that they can blow off steam and then go home and be with their families. But some of the other people in the department think that that's a silly idea and make that very known and, pressure them to come out for drinks instead and blow off steam that way. What are your thoughts around that also and sort of mitigating that concept?
Uh, um, I have mixed thoughts on it. So there's actually a book, and I was just trying to look it up. I don't remember the author's name. It's called Choir Practice, and it talks about the concept of some after work drinks, usually in a parking lot in the back lot of the police station or across the street at some abandoned building where you get together after shift and suck back a few beverages and either talk about things that were happened that shift, maybe something that was bothering you, something funny. Maybe it was just a rough week, but it's a way to connect with your squad or your partners, and that can be a really good thing. It builds relationships, both in the moment and long term. It creates a positive affect in your emotions. It can be a level of engagement that is not formalized and required, so it's voluntary, which creates a different level of emotion with that engagement. It's meaningful, and you're also able to talk about each other's accomplishments as well as the ball breaking. So, having all of that said, it definitely leads to the individual's well being. Uh, and that whole concept of PERMA, which I just kind of went through a lot of those steps, which is a theory put together by Dr. Marty Seligman, who created the whole positive psychology concept, it's useful. I will say this: infusing alcohol into any of that, while in the moment is always good, or feels good, I should say, it may not necessarily be good long term, depending on the individuals involved. And for short term reasons, like now you've had a half a case of beer and you're driving home. So clearly, we're trying to avoid DUI issues here, as well as coming home under the influence. And we all know that our emotions are definitely not in check when we're under the influence. And if something is said or something's not good when you get home, the chances of you getting to a fight with your spouse or your kids is definitely at a elevated level when you come home drunk. But it's again the importance of that bonding moment is great for choir practice. I don't always love that it involved alcohol. Again, it felt good in the moment. I don't know long term that's great decisions. Uh, and if you have somebody in your group that struggles with substance abuse, now you're enabling that. And in the first responder world, especially law enforcement, substance abuse with alcohol is a major factor. And a lot of that is just promulgated on stress relief. And if I wonder what it would look like if we all went to the gym together after work and had these conversations versus to the local parking lot putting down, cases of Bud Heavies. So there's ways to do it that are productive. There's ways to do it that are destructive. And I think we need to be better about how we're showing up when that moment ends and we get home. So
Yeah.
yes, it can go both ways.
Yeah. I,
Choir practice is awesome. It's just a matter of how you make it awesome.
exactly. Yeah. I think we need to rebrand choir practice and like take it to the gym instead of
Exactly.
to the back lot because to your point, blowing off that steam and connecting with the people that you work with and the people that understand what you're experiencing is obviously super important, but the way you go about it can be detrimental
100%.
to your personal life and to your career. So
Yeah.
Um,
And nothing ends a career like getting a DUI at 7 in the morning on the way home from work. Uh, and it's happened.
yes, yeah, yeah. Um, so yes, choir practice is a good thing, but maybe we should revisit how we're going about it, I think.
I
You
agree.
said that there was a book called Choir Practice. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. I know the concept is in the book.
Oh, okay, cool.
Oh, you know what? It's called Choir Boys. And then
Oh,
in
okay.
there, they talk about uh, the whole idea of choir practice. It's a book about cops. It's by Joseph Wambaugh, and the book itself is called The Choir Boys. And the concept of choir practice is brought up in the book. I think it's a fictional book around LAPD, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, interesting. I'll definitely have to look into that. Sounds interesting. Um, okay, so another thing that you talk about in your book is an internal affairs investigation.
Hmm.
And obviously, like, I don't want to give too much away about your book because I want people to read your book. Um, but do you have, after having gone through something like that, do you have any advice for people going through a fishy internal affairs investigation? Because while I was reading that part of your book, I feel like that is the epitome of being between a rock and a hard place. It's like you can't do anything, and
Right.
like nothing is right. So what do you have any advice for anyone who might be going through something like that?
So we're humans. We all make mistakes. And the most important thing you can do is take accountability and responsibility for your mistakes. Jocko Willink talks about extreme ownership, and it's basically a leadership principle that is a top-down view of your mistakes. I also, having not been in leadership, look at it from a bottom-up point of view. And I think you gain more respect from those above you and those to the left and right of you when you're like, yeah, I screwed that up. Take accountability for your mistakes. Now, that's easy, right? We can do that. Generally speaking, bad things don't come out of taking accountability for your mistakes. The problem is when you have people on the other side that are looking for mistakes and then try to use them against you. And that is partly what happened in my case with the incident that you're referring to in the book. And I had a supervisor that took advantage of me reporting broken equipment and then claiming I never reported it. Now, that was not, I did what I was supposed to do. And then that individual failed to support me as a supervisor and used it as an opportunity to screw me. As that process elevated into the internal affairs realm, the supervisor's word was what became gospel. And I was the one looked at like I wasn't being accountable for my actions. My actions were documented, but the supervisor's words seemed to have trumped that documentation. So that literally almost killed me, as we talked about in the book, or I talked about in the book. And all I can say is that be true to yourself, know that the truth does come out in the end, and you may or may not be punished justly or unjustly for your actions, but they are just punishments. Don't ever look at yourself in a way that's judgmental or fear being judged by others, where you'll end up making a permanent decision for something that was a temporary problem. And that's where I did not have the counsel that was needed or appropriate along that journey. The other thing I would say is whether you are authentic in your accountability for a mistake or you feel like you're being targeted for something that's ridiculous, always have somebody there to represent you, or at least be there to make sure that what you're hearing and what's being said to you is proper. Don't ever walk into these circumstances alone. Have some sort of representation. It doesn't have to be an attorney. It doesn't even have to be a union rep. Just somebody that hears it clearer than you, because you're walking into these conversations with tunnel vision and often in a very defensive posture, which can come across as guilty before being proven so, or if proven so at all. And you're not being dealt with in a way by your superiors that's going to benefit you if you don't have somebody there listening to the information with you. Because then you can always go back to that third party and be like, hey, did I really hear this right? Did this sound right to you? Am I missing something here? And just have somebody that can help guide you through the process. Because when you are in that fight or flight response mode of an internal affairs investigation, your perspective and your scope is so narrow that you are not going to be properly prepared to respond in a way that's going to benefit you. You know, they always say that any attorney that represents themselves in court has a lawyer has a client as a fool, and I believe that to be the same way in law enforcement, where we can't walk into these situations without a fresh set of eyes and ears sitting beside us. So have representation and just know that it will end the way it ends. Hopefully there's something you can do to affect that. And if there isn't, it is what it is. But don't make a permanent decision over a temporary problem.
I think that's really good advice. So thank you for sharing that. Also in your book, you touched on this earlier. You have a lot of facets in your life. You know, from your involvement at 9/11, Ground Zero, you had family in the Holocaust. You and your family have had a lot. Like there were a lot of stories in the book, and it was captivating. Um, all that said, you are helping with another book right now with
Yes.
The Power of Our Story, which I mentioned in the beginning. That's how you and I are acquainted. Are you able to share about that book?
Yeah, I don't see why not. So the Power of Our Story is a ground level grassroots organization started by Sarah Carell during the pandemic time. And it was actually probably it was prior to the pandemic, and she can tell her own story much better than I can. And she created this fireside chat based on an interaction she had with some folks in a certificate program, graduate certificate program that she was a part of. And because of the pandemic, it was no longer in person, and she took it to Zoom and opened it up to people all across the country. I was introduced to her through somebody that was in her inner circle, was a retired Navy SEAL. And the ability to connect with folks that were struggling with similar or related concerns that I had for myself, mostly transition out of uniform and into the private sector, it created an opportunity to share stories in a way that, one, you recognize you weren't alone in your own struggles, and two, you could look at and hear from other people that came through a challenge. This is how they got to the other side, and this is what they're doing now. And you could see yourself in those stories and create a plan for yourself based on the experience of others. That vicarious relationship with somebody else's journey allows for someone to get through those challenges of their own with almost like somebody else's roadmap. And it's a very important way to connect people and to create your own sense of healing. So the concept of the power of our story is about healing each other through storytelling, which we've talked a lot about already today. So the book, all these years later, is now going to be comprised of 30 of these storytellers that are part of the power of our story. I'm so fortunate to be one of them. And the book is going to be called Wounds to Wisdom. And a lot of, not a lot, the concept of the book is to provide people with a literary, a visual, something they can hold that may not be part of the group, but want to learn from the people that have succeeded and progressed through this process. And it's very powerful. There's going to be a ton of authors in there. I believe there's 30 altogether from a variety of different experiences, whether they be veterans, special forces folks, first responders from law enforcement, fire, and EMS. There's Gold Star family members that are represented in the book. And it's just a really special opportunity for me, but also I think for the greater opportunity is for those that need to hear those stories and read those stories. One of the things that I often talk about is, as humans, and then especially as first responders, we carry really heavy bags with us. And if we're not careful, we can pass those heavy bags on to the next generation, whether it be our kids, grandkids. At some point along your own journey, you need to lighten the load in those bags, because when you do pass them down, you don't want them to be as heavy for the next person as they were for you. So if you can unload some of those stories, unload some of the weight in those bags, and then have people learn from what you're taking out and showing them, you can take that stuff and put it in storage, and they're no longer in the bags that you're carrying. So for the storyteller, it provides a lighter load along the rest of your journey, but it also provides the opportunity for other people to carry less weight of their own, knowing that they can take those same pieces that you've set aside and set aside it for themselves. So that's what I believe the power of our story and the power of storytelling in itself is so effective. And I look forward to the book coming out and sharing all of these stories with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I'm excited too. It sounds amazing, and Sarah is amazing. She's also a civilian who, I think, going back to the beginning of our conversation, has taken the time to understand some of the intricacies and the nuances of veteran families, military families, law enforcement, first responder families, all of that. And so I think she's just such a beautiful person. And I love her for what she's doing. And yeah, she's just wonderful.
And she's one of three people that is the reason I'm sitting here today. She absolutely provided me a platform, an avenue, a place where I could find my own voice and learn about who David Berez was outside of the uniform he wore for more than 20 years. And that changed everything for me. So I credit her and two other people with literally saving my life, because without that platform that she created for people like me to find out who they really are and express that part of them to the world, this conversation wouldn't be taking place.
Wow, that's really powerful. And actually, it kind of segues into what I want to talk about next, because I think that you have a very unique perspective, because from what I can kind of understand, you were very much a cop in a lot of ways. You became a cop young, you lived for the job, you loved adrenaline, you got to do cool things and impress pretty girls and all of the things, and you excelled in your career. And then, you got married and you had your family and still had your career, and it kind of just took time for you to have this revelation that life wasn't about playing cops and robbers. There was more to who you are and what you were doing on this planet. And I think that sometimes that part doesn't always happen. The revelation, the realization that there's more to life than the job, so to speak, doesn't always happen. So because you started very relatable, cops start that way a lot of times, and went through the motions and the movements and the realizations, versus someone like my dad who got into the job kind of older. So I feel like sometimes people can't necessarily relate to his story because he was always kind of like, this is a job.
Yeah.
So I think you have a very unique perspective and very relatable perspective. Um, can you talk a little bit about just that realization, how you navigated it, how you were open to it even? Because I think that a lot of times people don't want to think about it, don't want to acknowledge it, don't want to even go there when they're in it. So can you talk about that a little bit?
So my transition, I think, as I mentioned earlier, was anything but graceful. And it was messy, it was uncomfortable, and I did it without purpose. When I retired, it was a family decision primarily, but I knew emotionally I had to retire. I checked out like 18 months before my retirement. And I mean, that's a whole nother discussion too, because I think if we can give cops sabbaticals once or twice through their career, you can have more longevity out of them as time moves forward. But that's a whole different discussion. As far as my transition goes, it was tough. And then purpose found me when Danny killed himself. And I realized that I was also in trouble and I needed to recalibrate. So my friend Michael, who was the newly minted chief resiliency officer for the county that I worked in, and was helping to craft this new program in New Jersey called the New Jersey Office of Resiliency for Law Enforcement, is really was my pivot point into the transition from not just David the cop who can't figure his shit out in civilian life, but who is David Berez and what can he do going forward? What's his purpose? What's his why? So I should speak briefly about the resiliency program and how that came about. And I'll go back quickly to 2008 when Dr. Seligman, who's the founder of the positive psychology field, had created a program for the Army called Comprehensive Soldier Fitness, which was a program that he was asked to do by General Casey in the middle of the Iraq and Afghan wars. And because they were starting to see all of these suicides within the military. So General Casey put this panel of Army leaders together, brought in Dr. Seligman, and they put together this program called the Master Resiliency Trainer Program. And what they did was it was an initial study of 1.6 million people and understanding what the ideologies were of the individual and how they can support the soldiers in battle. So when they come home, they're not going to engage in self-harm activities. Part of that was providing a sense of resiliency tools to the soldiers pre-deployment, and therefore, when things went sideways on them, they had things to fall back on, and started their resiliency recovery process at a much higher level, emotional regulational level, and it was successful. So they put this master resiliency program together and they trained, I don't remember how many drill sergeants it was. It was like 1,000 drill sergeants in the Army. They trained them, who then trained different cohorts of soldiers in this resiliency framework. Fast forward, the Air Force takes it over into their branch, and it was also very successful. And then later on, the FBI recognized this as a good tool for law enforcement as well. So the FBI National Academy Associates, which is kind of like the non-federal agents version of the FBI, it's local law enforcement and state law enforcement professionals, mostly executive professionals in the law enforcement field. They get trained by the FBI in leadership principles. So the FBI-NA puts together a program for law enforcement, and New Jersey immediately recognizes the value in this after we had a ton of suicides. And I know I'm getting off track here, but I'll come back full circle in a second. And so we developed a program in New Jersey in 2019 and 2020. I was the second cohort of folks that got trained as MRTs in New Jersey. And what was important for us is that it's a train-the-trainer philosophy. So we were able to train initial, I think it was 400 people. And by the way, I was only the second retired guy to have gone through the program. My downfall after Danny's suicide recognized that even retired cops are still struggling with stuff that happened at work 20 years ago. So we needed to incorporate the retirees, which is kind of what I do now with the state. And that set me on this track of purpose finding me. So when Danny took his own life, my buddy Michael was like, whoa, this kid needs help, because I put out this article about Danny and his circumstances, and it was picked up in a way that somebody saw trouble in me based on my words in that article. So Michael was like, hey, you can go and take the next resiliency class, the second one that we're putting on, or we can, find you a 30-day vacation in Florida somewhere. And so I took the resiliency class, and not only was it good for me, it gave me purpose to continue to give back, but to give back to my people and to serve my people in a way that was meaningful and purposeful. And that transitioned me into the next phase of my life. So coming back to your question full circle is when somebody's transitioning, they need to do it with purpose and understand who they are as the individual outside of the uniform. Because that uniform, while it's an important job, it's a valuable job and a purposeful one, it's not who the individual is. It's a part of their story, it's a part of their journey, it's an important one, but it's not the whole story. And finding who you are and what is your why is so important. And for me, my why is service to others. So I was able to find a way, or it found me actually, uh, where I can continue service to others outside of the uniform. So now I go back to serving my own people who are still in uniform, as well as other retirees who have not yet found their own purpose. And not that I'm going to find purpose for them, but we're there to support them with their own vices if they need to be.
Yeah, I love that. Have you heard of the Victor 6 program?
I have not.
It was started by a man named David Christian. It's here, they host it at the NAC at the Newtown Athletic Center. And David Christian, if I'm not mistaken, he's the most decorated Vietnam veteran. But he started this program. So my husband is a trainer. He went through the program and now he's going to be a trainer for the program. But it seems similar. It's based on, the same philosophy. I think their tagline is like a strong body builds a strong mind. And so his mission really is to have it's for veterans. So his mission is to sort of have veterans come learn how to move their body, make their bodies stronger and continue living a fulfilling life. They even have like Vietnam vets go through the program even to
Hmm.
this day. It's a really cool program, but it seems like it might be of a similar vein. I think that programs like this are very important. One thing I wanted to bring up is specifically that older age group because I personally think that older the older population of retirees, we're talking about law enforcement here, is sort of underserved because,
I agree.
a lot of times cops, they retire fairly young, they've got a whole nother career, and that in and of itself is a transition and it's not easy and that's a whole process. But even beyond that, what about the cops who transitioned some time ago? Maybe they did have another job, but they're in sort of the later phases of life. And we actually have quite a few of these people at the Power of Our Story, and they always have incredible things to share and lessons and stories and everything. But I often wonder, how do those people continue to serve? How do they find their purpose? Because again, they're in a stage of life where maybe they physically can't be
Right.
as involved as maybe they want to be.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a broken record at this point, but I think it comes back to storytelling.
Mhm,
And I think if the older individual, maybe we're talking about somebody that's in their 80s that, hasn't been a cop in 30 or 40 years.
mhm,
You're right. What can they do to process things that they've never processed before?
mhm.
Because back then, this discussion on mental health didn't exist.
Yep.
It was, pull up your bootstraps and let's get the heck out of here. Let's keep moving.
Mhm,
And they never took the opportunity to go through the emotional processing of things. And they didn't see anything less worse than we did.
mhm,
It was just not dealt with. And I think there's a real disservice to those people. But how much can we learn from the 85-year-old guy who was a police officer in the 40s and 50s that's just sitting in a nursing home with their grandkids that come and visit once a week if they're lucky? The value of information that person holds that they can share with other parts of the community, whether it's other first responders or other community members, and the effect that that can have for them so they can proceed with that sense of accomplishment and that they were able to pass on their experience. Some of that storytelling piece is so big, especially for those that can't do something else to serve the community. They can do a lot of service just by expressing themselves. So yeah, I think that would be very helpful for the older generation. And I love the idea that there's this physical activity program at the NAC. which is the Newtown Athletic Center. I don't know if we spoke the acronym yet. Uh, and I wonder, not I wonder, I'd love to see the beginning and end stages of somebody that's been through that program, to where physical activity, and there's a book called Spark by John Rady that talks about the mind body connection. And I love that because quick thought is that when I was in college and I was in the Sigma Phi Epsilon fraternity, our motto was spirit healthy, body healthy. So I love coming back to that when it pops up. But yeah, physical activity creates a chemical reaction in our brain that helps us not only process information, but it also gives us positive affect in our emotions. And I could completely geek out on the science, but I don't think it's necessary. But it exists. The research is there. If you want to know more about it, I would absolutely recommend John's book called Spark. And it's effective in younger people, like kids, all the way up to older people that are in their 80s and 90s. And the research is fascinating on how physical activity generates creativity and positive affect in your emotions. So for those that can't do that, I think storytelling is probably the next best thing.
Yeah, I agree. And regardless of sounding like a broken record, I think it needs to be said because a lot of people, especially I would say in this profession, are a little bit hesitant to open up that box and start
Yeah.
sharing those stories. But I think it's very important, not even just for the public and the people you're sharing the stories with, but also for the individual who's sharing those stories. Um,
Researchers in the psychology field say that growth happens beyond the edge of your comfort zone. So even when you're in that older stage of life, if you want to extend your years, or even have those years be as positive as possible, going beyond that comfort zone of where you may not like to share those stories, I think on the other side of having those words come out of your mouth and hearing them out loud would be such a cathartic process, no matter the age or experience you've had.
yeah, I agree. What would you have done differently during your transition out of law enforcement? You've mentioned that it was not a smooth transition. In retrospect, what do you think you could have done differently?
Uh, I I think it's important before you retire to know what your next chapter looks like. And by the nature of what we do as cops, on one hand, we walk into things that are the unknown. We kick our way through doors that we don't know what's on the other side of them. But on the other hand, we're very type A, very almost like OCD when we plan entries, when we plan our trainings, when we enact on our trainings, even if it's a motor vehicle stop, you're doing the same thing, same way every time to protect yourself. That way, when things do go sideways or things do go out of plan, you don't have to think about in a conscious way what to do next. It becomes reactionary, which leaves space for conscious thought on how to manipulate the circumstances. We don't do that when we retire. We retire into this abyss. Uh, the common phrase is, "I'm going to become a greeter at Walmart and live happily." Yeah, that'll last about 5 minutes before you're bored out of your mind and you can no longer tolerate dealing with the Walmart shopper. So there's, while it sounds great and it's a funny story to tell, it really doesn't work. So you need to retire with something that's purposeful to you. I don't care if it's woodworking. I don't care if it's a stay-at-home parent where you're going to cut the lawn 3 days a week and make sure your flowers are manicured and the mulch is in good order, and you're going to sweep your sidewalks. If that's your purpose, awesome. But have a reason to wake up every morning. I did not retire with that advice. I did not retire with that sense of purpose. And I did not retire with a reason to wake up every morning. And I thought I knew what I wanted to potentially do when the dust settled post retirement. But then, of course, the pandemic happened. And then, of course, the George Floyd thing happened. And then all of the civil unrest happened. And anything that I thought of was just irrelevant. and I needed to recalibrate. And I didn't do it soon enough because it almost ate me alive, literally. But all I can say is if I could do something different, it would be have a plan before the retirement day comes. And don't be a greeter at Walmart. It's not purposeful. Not
No,
purposeful.
I think it'll get real old real quick.
Yeah. We're high speed, low drag people. And while I can understand, the allure of fishing every, 3 days on a pristine lake somewhere in Eastern Tennessee might be awesome, that loneliness grows fast.
Mhm.
And it may be good for a week or two, maybe even a month or two. But we as much as we hate people, we need to be around them. And just that isolation is not good in your own thoughts.
Yeah,
Have a purpose. Write that next chapter, write the first page of the next chapter of your book before you get to the end of the first chapter.
very well said. I love that. Um, Yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, I read you wrote a post, I think on LinkedIn, about pop optimism. That was the first time I've seen you mention that. Can you talk about what that is?
So part of my uh, school experience this past year in positive psychology culminated in my graduation last weekend, which I'm really excited about. And I am not a self-indulgent person, but I'll mention that every chance I get. And it was a program I was really proud of and happy to be a part of. One of the theories in positive psychology is optimism. Positive optimism goes hand in hand. The science behind optimism. And during one of the classes this past semester, actually the first class of this spring semester, Dr. Seligman, who is affectionately known to us as Marty, was came to us at lunch. And Marty is kind of a big deal in the psychology world, as in, just so there's some perspective and context on this. People look at Aristotle, Plato, Freud, Marty Seligman. So he is a big deal, and to have him as a mentor, as a teacher, and now as a friend is something that I value so incredibly beyond any other experiences besides kids and marriage that I've had in my entire life. So Marty, the first lunch of this semester, says to me and one other guy in the room, in a room full of probably 20 people, the other guy was an Army veteran, and he goes, I got a question for you guys. What allows police officers or military folks to run into or towards gunfire when everybody else is running the other direction? And me and the other guy look at each other like, I don't know, it's just kind of our job. It's what we do. He goes, no. Like, what allows you to do that? And I'm like, I don't know, quick feet, good training. Like we didn't really know where he was getting at, and because for us, it's also so innate. Like that's just what you do. When those moments happen, it's your job to keep everybody safe, even at your own peril. And that's what he was asking the question about. What about how do you set aside your own peril for the safety and security of others? And we didn't have a good answer. And he was like, well, I want to know what the theory behind that is. He's a career academic, and he wanted to understand what the academic theory or the scientific theory was behind running towards gunfire when everybody else is running away. We were at a loss. And you're talking to a very, I think, two intelligent people. One is an Army officer and the other one is a career police officer, but we couldn't put the answer into an academic context for him. So I dug into it a little deeper over the next couple of weeks and a month or so. And I came up with this concept and this theory, because that's what he was looking for, of courageous optimism. And courageous optimism is what I believe allows an individual in those circumstances to act in a way that's effective. It combines moral will and moral skill to have an effective positive outcome. And I've kind of combined those two words, courageous optimism, in the form of law enforcement, and that's where we get optimism. And I think that as I researched this further and I put more time and effort into dividing up the pieces of the theory, we're trying to put together a journal article scientific journal article to put optimism on the map. And my goal is to then, once that gets picked up in the years ahead, find funding where I can do additional research on that and get that out into the world and have people understand what makes us tick in these moments of crisis.
Wow, that's incredible. I think that could be a real game changer for the entire profession. So,
That's my hope. Now it's time to find money to support it.
yeah,
So if anybody is out there and is interested in supporting this research, please let me know.
that's always the thing.
Yeah,
Congratulations, by the way, on your graduation
thank you.
and also on the Police Unity Tour. So while we're recording this, Police Week just wrapped up a couple days ago, and you participated in the Police Unity Tour. Can you share about what that is, but also your experience with it? Because that's phenomenal.
Absolutely. This was my 13th consecutive year with the Unity Tour. And the Unity Tour started back in 1996 with 18 police officers from Florham Park, New Jersey, who wanted to find a way to memorialize and honor fallen law enforcement officers. And they did so with a charity bicycle ride of the 18 founders of the organization, Pat Montori being the initial guy who retired as the chief of police of Florham Park PD in New Jersey. So the ride is 300 miles from New Jersey to Washington, D.C. It takes place over 4 days. And at this point in the organization's history, there's 9 active chapters of the Unity Tour around the country from New Jersey to California. And we all, for the most part, originate in someplace in New Jersey. There's a few that are south of DC and Virginia, North Carolina, where the rides initiate from. There's multiple chapters that start together in the same place. I'm part of Chapter 10, which is Central New Jersey. I originally started my time with the organization in Chapter 1, which is North Jersey. But as the participation grew within Mercer County, where I live, we all kind of navigated and congregated with Chapter 10, which was closer to home. And it's a way to honor fallen law enforcement officers in a very public way. It's not a protest. It's not a anything adverse. It's not for raising a cause or a perspective. It's literally just honoring those that died in the line of duty. And the motto of the organization is "We ride for those who died." The other side of it is a fundraiser for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. And we from the Unity Tour are the primary funders of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum in Washington, D.C. We are over, I want to say it's $35 million in donations to the organization and to the memorial. This year, raising just over $2 million. It was like 2,450,000, I think. Sorry, no, $2,045,000 was the amount this year. So there's anywhere between 2,000 and 2,500 riders each year that ultimately culminate at the RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. And then we ride from there, all chapters together, all 2,500 of us, into the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is about 4 miles from the stadium. It's an unbelievable experience of camaraderie, of brother and sisterhood, a way to unite and network both personally and professionally, and all for the honor of those that never made it home. And what's an interesting thing to talk about is the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C. was built in 1996, I believe, and they had created it under George H.W. Bush to last 100 years. So the granite of the walls where the names are engraved into was supposed to last for 100 years based on the yearly stats that they had to date in 1996. Fast forward to 2024, the last name on the original granite was placed this year, and they added granite space for another 15,000 names because after 28 years, the walls are filled. To think about, not that long ago, they figured this wall would last 4 times as long as it did.
Wow.
And the walls are now filled. So the memorial now has another section added to it on top of the original granite, with the availability to put another 15,000 names. And when you do the math, that's only about 13 years from now. So the average yearly loss of law enforcement officers is about 180. I think it's 182 to be exact right now. A lot of that is related to an uptick in medical deaths over the last 4 years, whether it be COVID. 9/11 illness is still killing first responders at a ridiculously alarming rate. And obviously police officers were the first responders on that scene. So it's still getting us. So those numbers keep ticking upwards. But yeah, the police shooting tour is a really special experience, and I don't ever see myself not participating. I got involved 13 years ago when my buddy, Trooper First Class Shaft Hunter, was killed in the line of duty in Maryland. And he was a canine officer, a Marine veteran, and unfortunately struck the back of a pickup truck on Route 95 in Laurel, Maryland. So, sorry, a tractor trailer on Route 95 in Laurel, Maryland that was illegally parked off the shoulder and into a lane of travel with no lights on it when he was pursuing a motorcycle down the highway. So Shaft was killed that day, May 21st of 2011, and I made a promise to his family, his kids, and his mom that I would, as long as I could pedal, he will never truly die. And Shaft did have 5 kids, does have 5 kids who are now adults, and beautiful family that he left behind.
And that's in your book.
It's all in the book.
And I read that portion of the book, just, how he was killed multiple times because I couldn't understand what you were saying as far as what happened, because I could not even comprehend the situation of how the truck was parked, how it had no lights on, how all of that just kind of manifested. I like highlighted it, I underlined it. I was like, how is this a thing? That was just horrifying to read.
So for law enforcement officers will definitely understand that these rest stops, especially along the interstate highways, they fill up with trucks pretty quickly as the nightfall comes about. And they're always often not safe places for people because a lot of criminal activity takes place at these truck stops during off hours, 3 in the morning or whatever time it might be. And so when they get overcrowded, instead of trying to pack in there, the trucks will line the highway in the areas of the rest stops so they can then get out of the trucks, walk to whatever stores are open, whatever restaurants are there. And unfortunately, it is not uncommon for trucks to be parked in the shoulder and not properly illuminated or even properly completely off the roadway into the shoulder. It's also something to remember for non-first responders that don't see that regularly and are traveling with their families, especially as we have Memorial Day and the summer coming up. If you happen to be driving at night and you're going by a rest stop, stay in the middle lane because there's a chance that there'd be a truck off the shoulder into the lane of travel, not lit up. And you certainly don't need to become one of those statistics.
Definitely. Can I ask, I don't remember if it was in the book, but was the driver of that truck like located, held accountable, anything?
I don't know the answer to that question. I may have at one point. I don't remember. That is not in the book. What happened to that driver? The motorcyclist did get away. And so that individual was, to my knowledge, never located. As far as the owner or the driver of the truck, I'm sure that they were recognized and identified because they had to have been there in some capacity. But I don't know if anything happened with them legally.
Okay. I was just curious. But I do, when it comes to the police unity tour, I have some logistical questions. So you said it takes place over 4 days. Do
Correct.
you rest at night? Do you like stay at a hotel? What does that look like?
We do stay at a hotel. I don't know if I'd call it rest because there's a lot of socialization and fraternization that takes place upon the evening as we, pack our stuff up for the day. And like all good law enforcement events, it culminates with a ton of imbibing of whatever your alcohol of choice is. But yeah, so like for us, day one ends in Atlantic City. And we stay at a hotel in Atlantic City, and we participate in everything that Atlantic City may or may not have to offer, which is often leads to late nights. And day two starts at like 7 o'clock in the morning for us, we get to the Cape May Lose Ferry. For those that are not familiar with the New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware area, otherwise known as Delmarva Peninsula, the ferry goes from Cape May, New Jersey to Lewes, Delaware. So we pack all the trailers, all the bikes, all the people from our chapter and chapter 13, which is Northern California, onto, I think it's 2 or 3 ferries at this point, and that goes over the mouth of the Delaware River near the Atlantic Ocean and into Lewes, Delaware. Then we ride from the exit point to our hotels in either Dewey Beach or other parts of the Delaware area. Rehoboth Beach is where some of the hotels are as well. Day 3, we'll go from Rehoboth Beach to Annapolis, and then we stay at the hotels in Annapolis, which is also a long night. Annapolis has a lot of fun to offer. And from Annapolis, Maryland, on day 4, we ride into DC. So we are very well taken care of at our sleeping places, and rest is supposed to be one of the things you're doing, but unfortunately doesn't always happen.
And is it only cops or can civilians participate?
It is cops only, primarily, retired and active, or active and retired. It's more active than retired, but it's the only civilians that are part of the Police Unity Tour are survivors of fallen law enforcement officers, and some civilians from like EMS or otherwise connected to the first responder world help in a support capacity. Whether it be administratively, whether it be on food and snacks and drinks, that kind of stuff. But the riders are all active and retired police officers or survivors of fallen police officers, and about half the survivors are police officers. So a lot of families involved.
Which makes a lot of sense. What kind of fitness level does one have to maintain? Because it sounds kind of intimidating.
It is intimidating. There's no secrets to the activity. You are riding your bicycle for 300 miles. It is well documented on the application that is the purpose of the event. So it is highly recommended, no matter how great of shape you're in, to get some seat time before the event. It's a different muscle group. It's a seat that may not be comfortable. It's a lot of time on a bicycle. It's 5, 6, 7 hours a day on a bicycle. Now, there are some people that don't look like they're in great shape that do just fine because they've ridden a couple miles before the tour begins. And then there's guys and girls that look like they're part of the SWAT team that can't make it past the first 10 miles and everything in between. So it is possible to do without being a physical fitness nut, but you do have to train a little bit. We do have the sag wagons and what we call the poop out vans, and that is available if you can't go any further, if you start to fall back. Personally, I'm in the group of the last riders. As a ride marshal, we're like, if you get behind us, you're getting in a van, because we will push you and try to help you as far as we can. But we have to ride 300 miles also. And if I have to do it with my hand on your back, that gets pretty tiring pretty quickly. And we'll give you the benefit of the doubt for each leg of the journey. But if you can't, you can't, and we'll pull you out and you can try again next time. Not next tour, but like the next leg of the ride.
Oh, cool.
And if we pull you, it's not permanent. It's just we need you to take a break to recalibrate and try again in a little bit. We have multiple stops throughout the day. The average length of each leg is somewhere between 15 and 20 miles, which is anywhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours. So the pace is, approximately 15 miles an hour, depending on the terrain of the day. It could be a little slower, but it can be done by anybody, but you got to put in a little bit of effort. You got to have a little bit of heart. You are going to hurt. You are going to be sore. You are going to get some bumps and bruises. It's bicycles. If you're a rider and you haven't crashed a bike, you're not really a rider. So at some point you're going to fall off. But yeah, it's a great time. The only thing that hurts more than our bodies is our liver at the end of the week. So there's definitely a lot of indulgence along the week. But it's also important to talk about the purpose, I think. And at the end of the bike ride, when we go through the memorial on our bicycles, the 25 or 30,000 people that are there to receive you is incredibly impactful and incredibly special. And that 3 minutes that it takes you to ride your bicycle around the circle of the memorial makes the last 297 miles worth it. And it's, you realize why you're there, because all the names on the wall, which is just over 25,000 right now, are there because they didn't make it home. They sacrificed themselves for the communities that they served. And you, no matter how bad your legs hurt, your back hurts, neck hurts, you're still here to allow those to feel that pain. And we ride for those that died, for those that can no longer pedal for themselves. And the impact is impalpable. It is truly undescribable, the emotions that you feel coming through those walls, and the cheering and seeing the faces of the kids whose mommy or daddy is on that wall gives you purpose for doing it again next year, because their mommy and daddy can't do it anymore, and you need to do it for them. So for me, that is what motivates me to keep coming back, as well as the support that it provides to the memorial, to the museum. And the museum is something that's incredibly important to me, especially at this phase where the final stage of my education for my master's degree is my capstone is going to involve the police museum in DC. So I'm pretty excited about that. So that place holds a special place in my heart, and the police unity tour was my avenue to get there.
That's awesome. And it's definitely a beautiful tribute. Do they have people along the way cheering you on?
There are, so usually family members of the riders, because we're not supposed to be sharing the route for safety purposes.
Oh,
There's been incidents in the past where the route has been shared and safety has been compromised. Uh,
that's
it
awful.
doesn't happen often, but it has happened. We've had, frozen water bottles thrown at us from bridge tops as we go under them. We had I think it was 2 years ago, complete lunatic that was driving around, circling the riders in his, like, it was like a movie scene. It was like a 1970s Buick, all beat up, and the guy looked like he would be driving a 1970s Buick. And as it turned out, he was a prior convicted felon for attacks on police officers. And so fortunately, nothing happened, but we don't publish the route for those reasons. So if you have a family member that knows, where you might be, yes, they show up. What is nice is, though, the fire departments generally know that we're coming through. The towns know that we're coming through. So they'll often set up fire trucks with flags hanging from them that we ride under, and little things like that keep it motivating, which is really nice.
That's really cool. That's really horrible and kind of ironic that that is a thing that you can't share the route and have people support you because of how terrible other people are.
Yeah,
It's a awful reality.
especially since when the whole thing is to raise awareness for fallen officers. Like, how do you
Exactly.
raise awareness if you can't tell people you're doing it? Like,
Exactly.
it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But I will say, people know we were there. When you have 2,500 cops riding through town on bicycles, all wearing the same jersey, all wearing the same shorts, with 500 motorcycles supporting you, and other police cars. And then while we're in New Jersey, New Jersey State Police covers us with a helicopter, and it's a pretty awesome experience.
Yeah. It sounds remarkable. Um, so before we wrap up, I want to talk about your family a little bit because you speak very highly of them, especially of your wife and the support that she has offered you. One quick thing just about one of the stories in the book about when your son saved your life in that instance. He called you because he was on his way to work and he wasn't sure if he was going to see you because you were going to come home after he had already left. Well, obviously, that was an emotional part of the book in general, but also was that was impactful to me to read because when we were young, depending on whatever my dad's schedule was, it was always changing. He would oftentimes be the one to wake us up for school so that he could see us before he went to sleep for the day or went off to work or whatever he needed to do, because a lot of times we wouldn't be able to see him again, depending on what his schedule was. So sometimes just to get FaceTime with us, he would be the one to wake us up before we left for school. So that story in the book was obviously very impactful in general, but that just sort of dual parallel, I guess, again, was impactful to me. Does he know that?
No, he doesn't know the story. That my kids have not read the book.
Yeah.
Um, I that is that story along with uh, the childhood story we talked about earlier in our discussion are two of the main points in my life that the book is the first time I've told them out loud. And my wife didn't know any one of those two stories or some of the others before she read the book. My kids don't know them. They don't know about my father's history either. They don't, and at some point, it's regrettable to me that I haven't had these open discussions with them because I find myself to be generally transparent and authentic and accountable. I just haven't had the heart to have those discussions with them, and maybe wrongfully so, but trying to protect them from the story. I do think at some point it needs to be discussed because I know they've had friends that have read the book. And so I don't know what's come out since then. They have not approached me with any questions regarding it. They have asked to read the book, but I don't know if I'm ready for it yet.
Okay. And so your two older kids are teenagers. So
Yeah.
when they ask to read the book, do you just let them know that you're not comfortable with them reading it at this time?
Yeah, I keep telling them, and again, probably not good parenting, but I keep telling them that not yet. They need to be a little bit older to be able to understand some of the stuff that's in there. And for me, it's just like a way of kicking the can down the road a little bit because I don't know that I'm ready to have some of the conversations about the content in there. And but that's on me. It's not on them. They are definitely mature enough and old enough. I just don't know that I'm ready for it.
Right. And I think that's fair. I think that you're entitled to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens when they get their hands on it. Or for all I know, they've read it and just aren't ready to ask yet themselves. So I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, and can you talk a little bit about how your relationship with your kids and your wife has grown over the years? Because as you know, the big thing I talk about a lot is being the child of a police officer who was very involved in our lives and very intentional about how he raised us with my mom. So if you could just kind of talk about that a little bit.
So I think that I hope that I was also very intentional with the way I raised my kids. I believe that I was involved very heavily in their lives at the time I was home. I know that I slept through some things. I know that I worked through some things, and based on the job responsibilities I had, especially in the narcotics world, that I got a lot of 3 a.m. and 3 p.m. phone calls, which were not working times on those various days, that I had to get called in to do certain things, and I would have to leave family events, or I didn't make it to the family events in the first place. And so I know there was things that I missed along the way, but everybody was always very understanding of that. While I was home, I made it my intention to be there wholeheartedly. Where I think I failed my family was in the transition process. I was physically and emotionally unavailable when I retired, and I regret that part because I think not only could have it helped me to engage my family in the transition, I think they lost a part of me for almost 2 or 3 years. And they were very formidable years for my kids, especially the teenage ages. Uh, but I think that my work day relationship with my family was pretty good. And I think just like your dad, I did things with intention to make sure that I was there for as much as I could be there for. And when I was physically there, I was also emotionally there. And I think those two things need to go hand in hand because if you're not emotionally there, it doesn't matter if you're there physically or not. And now in this side of retirement, I have made my family 100% my priority. And I am at every baseball game. I am at every softball or lacrosse game. I'm do as much horseback riding for my daughter as I can get her to. My wife, we share that responsibility. Uh, but I won't miss out on anything because of work at this point. And while I have my own business on the side, just finishing school for this past year, I will always put my family first, and I will make time for the other things when when that time is available for me to do them. But right now, it's family first always, and I think the relationship with everybody has significantly improved over the last couple of years. However, during my working days, I don't know that it was ever truly bad. Just sadly, I happen to miss things because of work. But when I was there 100%.
Which I think is what really matters because as long as you're there 100% when you can be, that's where the impact is made. And with that, if you can't physically be there for the dance recital or the horseback riding lesson or whatever it is, it's it's less impactful. It doesn't matter as
Right.
much because we just spent the entire day at the park or whatever silly little thing you did on your day off together. So and I think really understanding that is what I try to get across because as a police officer you're going to miss things. It's just the nature of the job. Your schedule's going to change, but as long as you are making the other times, the times where you can be there, impactful, and you're being intentional about that is really what's going to make an impact on your kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And at this point, my goal is to be here when they go to sleep, be here when they wake up, just like you spoke about earlier with your dad coming home. And they grow up so fast, and kids grow up so fast that I don't want to miss these sacred moments. Whether it be a baseball game, whether it be a college application, my son's getting his driver's license on Tuesday. I would not miss any of that at this point in my life because I know not only is it important for me to be there for me, it's important for them for me to be there for them because those are memories that they'll carry with them for the rest of their life. And I don't want to be remembered as the guy that was my dad, but was never really there to support me. So I want to be part of the stories of their stories.
Yeah, because what I talk about and what I'm going to ask you is this concept of a legacy, and your legacy is going to be carried on by them essentially, and the memories that they have with you and with their mom. But um you want to allow them and afford them those memories, even if they're not like the typical memories that some of their friends have. They're making your own kind of memories so that they have them.
Yeah, I agree. And legacy can sound self-indulgent and it can sound selfish, but I don't know that it truly is. We all create such an impact throughout the average lifespan of a male, in my case, for 72 years of the existence of the world, which is not very long time. But the impact that we have in that average of 72 years is significant. And I often have the conversation on the difference between significance and success. Success is something that's extrinsic that other people judge you by. Significance is how you judge yourself and what you're able to give to somebody else. So if I want to leave a significant legacy behind, it's important that I incorporate what I've done along the way with the people that mean the most to me. Because if they carry my legacy along with them, part of what my bags are holding, while my body may pass on and be buried in some graveyard, my soul will continue in their hearts forever. And hopefully, when they have children or grandchildren of their own, that legacy continues in those stories. I know it does for me and the generations that came before me, some of which I note in the book. And I carry the stories of my grandparents and great grandparents that have, on both sides of my family, perished in the Holocaust. And to the point where I have pictures of them on the walls in my office. And I hope that someday somebody will talk about me and my story and my journey where they can learn from it and understand history through it in the same way that I've done with the family members that came before me.
Which I think is a full circle moment to how we started this conversation, coming all the way back to this concept of storytelling. because yeah, your legacy and what you instill in your life and therefore your children's lives is what's going to live on for generations. And you want that to be a positive thing, a positive impact, um, a light for people to look at years down the road, once you're gone, maybe even once your kids are gone, and so on and so forth. Um, so again, going back to that concept of storytelling, continue telling your stories. Is there anything that we didn't talk about in this interview today that you want to put out there?
So I think the only thing, first of all, we talked a lot about a lot, and
Yes.
so grateful for that opportunity. And I feel like this conversation could go on for another 2 hours if we would
Yes.
allow it. Uh, the one thing that's important to me now in the work that I'm doing now and going forward, which we talked a little bit about on the courageous optimism front, is that when we have discussed law enforcement and first responder mental health, uh, collectively in our society as it is today, we often talk about mental illness and how to treat people from the perspective of meliorism. How can we treat people that need support from the mental illness perspective? I think that is a very small part of the population. So small that it's odd for me that that's all we talk about when we talk about mental health. For me, I think the concept of positive psychology that treats or promotes mental wellness as opposed to mental illness is where we need to recalibrate and focus our discussions in the concept of mental health in law enforcement and other first responders. Because the traumas, the incidents that we accumulate over the course of our careers and our lives, while they are significant, there's such a small population where that creates mental illness.
Mhm.
What we don't have is a way to coach people through those processes, or they don't have the proper tools to allow them to overcome those adversities. And it's easy to classify it as illness. However, if we can coach people through those moments, give them the tools to work through them on their own, we can have a greater discussion on mental wellness, which is taking people from a survival mode to a thriving mode. And my goal going forward is to change that narrative. While it's important to understand where mental illness lies and the therapeutic responses that we can provide for those, I think mental wellness is a greater outlook on how we can stem the tide of suicide and self-destructive behaviors.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. And you're doing a lot of things right now. How can people find you if they want to get your book, if they want to get your services? I'll put everything in the show notes, but if you could just share that.
The book is on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble, wherever you find your preferred literature. There's also, I'm proud to say that it's in the University of Pennsylvania bookstore as well as some other smaller bookstores in the New England area where we spend a lot of time that has smaller personally owned bookstores. Uh, if you want to follow my trajectory and what I've been involved in and the writings that I do, LinkedIn is a great space for that. My website has some basic information as well, which is 64consultants.com, and six spelled out, SIX, the number four, consultants.com. And my contact information is also there, both at the website and on LinkedIn. I encourage anybody that wants to talk further about the passion points that we've discussed to personally reach out, and I'd be happy to support anybody's initiatives and agendas and collaborate with your work.
That's awesome. Thank you again. Like you said, I feel like this conversation could go on for hours and hours. But this was an awesome conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a special experience to follow you as well and the work that you're doing from the perspective that you bring as a child, as a family member, uh, is so unique and so needed, because the warriors we leave behind at home are just as important as those that go to fight the battles every day. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. Thank you.